Yes, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for being here. And I appreciate those of you who have your camera on, although Krista, you're driving, so don't even talk to us. So yes, good afternoon and welcome to the October session of your professional development sessions. I'm going to go ahead and ask you, those of you who can, to in the chat, if you would just type in where you work, your position, and where your center or school is located as far as what community you're in. And then that way just gives me a little idea of who's here. And then I'll introduce myself as well. But let me just give you some time and I'm going to look at the chat really quick. So remember to tell us where your center or school is located. Okay, I see. Spanish bilingual. West Chicago 33 in the house. Okay. Oh, Prospect Heights. Lansing. Ingleside. Awesome. Urbana School District. Great. Family support specialists as well as teachers, assistant directors. Great. Well, welcome everyone, and thank you for being here again. We are going to be talking about children's language development, but let me also just take a few minutes to introduce myself as everybody continues to type into the chat today. I am a former, well, first of all, I guess I should say my name's Ileana Alanis, and I'm a former first and second grade teacher. So on the right-hand side, that big first grader with the big hair, you know, that would be me. And I tell people we were just coming out of the 80s. So we still had permed, big hair. This is in 1991. So that's how I got started. I was first grade and then I went into second grade as a teacher. Currently, though, since 2005, I've been at the University of Texas, San Antonio. I'm a professor of early childhood elementary education, and we are roadrunners. And I was just going to point out that, yes, we do see real roadrunners on the campus. And of course, in my neighborhood, we see them as well. And we like roadrunners because they not only eat insects, but they eat snakes. So when you live out in the country like I do, we like roadrunners. So currently that's where I'm at. I'm a professor. I'm also an author. So some of you may have already had access to one of our recent texts that I produced with co-authors, The Essentials, but a lot of my work comes through NAEYC. And so I'm also an author. And then because I'm a former governing board member for the NAEYC, I also wanted to make this little commercial that NAEYC does have their annual conference coming up just next month. So I encourage you to not only support the Illinois AEYC and your local AEYC, but also, start bugging your director to send you to the NAEYC conference. And then I also really why I'm here today is because I'm one of the founding members for the consulting group Vales por Dos. And Vales por Dos is a Spanish saying that literally translated means, it's el que habla dos idiomas vale por dos. So he who speaks two languages is worth two people, is the literal translation. But really what it's saying is that we view language as a strength. We view language as an asset. And we really believe, right, our philosophy is that young children come into our school settings, into our centers with linguistic wealth that we need to capitalize on and leverage for children's growth and development. And so all of those experiences that I have had is really the lens through which I'm approaching today's session. And so today's session, we're going to look at language development, but this is language development for young children in an all English setting, language development for children who are English is their second language, but they are also in an English setting, and also, of course, children who are in dual language programs receiving instruction in their home language as well as in English. And so what I envisioned for the next 90 minutes really is that we would talk about young children have this inclination to communicate with others. They want to play with other children. They're not thinking about what language to speak in or how to say it. They're just excited about communicating with others and having fun with that language. So we're going to talk about that. And then I want to also look at some strategies that you can use to really empower children to become effective communicators as they become more socially connected. And then we're going to talk about what you as a teacher can do to promote children's oracy, also in not only in their home language, but in English as well. So a lot of our focus today, because we're talking about young children, will be on oracy, which is we'll talk about as well. Throughout the session, I'll have time at the end for questions, but if you'd like to pose a question in the chat, feel free to do that. And if I'm going to discuss it, I'll tell you, hold on to that and I'll talk about it in a minute, or if not, I'll try to address it at that time. Okay, so let's think about, we're going to tap into prior knowledge. What do we already know about language development? So I want you to use the chat feature and just kind of do a quick, I know that language development, kind of fill in the blank. So what is it that you already know about language development? And we'll look at the chat. Because I'm doing a webinar. Sorry, talking over here. Okay, it's progressive, that children can learn multiple languages. It's different, right? For each child's individual stages. Oh, I have to give the thank you to Krista Overstreet for the shout out, the Essentials book. It starts at home, learning stages, definitely. Yes, children with disabilities learning more than one language is not an issue. We want them to. Languages, comprehension and communication. Yes. Enhances children's vocabulary, helps them communicate, right? And so we are going to be talking a lot about how is it that children use language for communication. Imitation is one aspect of language development. Definitely. Okay, good. So let's keep that in mind, and I'm going to go ahead and move forward. And I want to just give us an overview of young children's language development, because we know that language development is happening throughout the day and different times of the day, whether it's through feeding, right, just playing or bathing. We know that, like somebody had said, language begins at home, and families are engaging in this process of turn taking with young children as they're helping them develop their language skills. So the idea then is that language happens through everyday moments and experiences, right? And all of these are spaces for developing not just language, but learning concepts. Children are learning concepts as well. So while we're feeding children, we can talk about, we can count how many Cheerios, or we can talk about, do you want more? Do you want less, right? Which is bigger, which is smaller. So we're also developing academic concepts without realizing it when we engage in these conversations. Oh, and I keep going back to the chat. So learning second language builds the synapses in the brain. Yes, definitely. And interactions are a part of that process. That the more I interact with another, the more the synapses in the brain make connections and start firing together. So I'm going to show you this little video. I got it off of Instagram, so it's kind of weird, but I want to just show you what children, really young children, can do with language. So let's see if we can get it to work. First, let me see.
The Swifties
if you can actually see the video. Yes? Okay, I see Tammy. Okay.
have invaded the NFL, and this little girl is the proof.
I am so excited for football.
You're excited for football?
Yeah.
Can you tell me what you like about football?
No, thank you.
Who's playing football?
I don't know.
Who's your favorite football player?
Taylor Swift.
The Swifties.
Okay. So what, if we just think of this little girl, what can she do with language? What can she do with language? And you can either unmute or you could put it in the chat. Answer questions.
Yeah, she's using it to communicate,
Yes.
what she likes and who her favorites are and
Yep. What she
what
likes.
things she knows.
Mm-hmm.
She comprehends what's being asked of her.
Definitely. And she's using some turn taking. I see that conversation. She's able to say no, thank you, right? So there's some pragmatics of language, how do we use language in different contexts? And she's definitely able to carry that conversation. So we know that young children are very capable of using language in multiple settings, starting at a very young age. But the other thing that we want to keep in mind is that how much language children actually hear and use is really going to determine the proficiency in that language. So if we're talking about a young bilingual child, how much language they hear in Spanish determines their proficiency in Spanish. How much language they hear in English determines their proficiency in English. But it also has to do with the quality of those language interactions that are really essential for helping children develop home language, second language, even a third language. So it's rich linguistic interactions is what we know is the key. And then lastly, it's that, and you all alluded to this in your chat about individualization, is that language development really is a complex phenomenon because it is shaped by so many aspects of children's lives. It's shaped by their age, who's at home with them, who's using language at home, their relationships with others, and of course, their experiences. Their experiences is also critical to language development. So what we know essentially is that language is developed best when children have meaningful exposure to that language. Meaningful, that means it makes sense for them, it's relevant, it's fun for them, and that they also have multiple opportunities to use language in interactions with others. We have a tendency to just do the one, they need to hear language, rich language from the adult, but we forget about they also need to use language in interactions with others. So we want to keep that in mind as we go throughout the session. And then I think if I want to kind of capture what the literature tells us about language development is that children learn through play. So they want to not only play with others, but they play with language. They need to actively explore their environment. They need to have these interactions with others. So that's that caregiver-child interaction, adult-child interaction. They need to have direct experiences, and that's what I want to talk about today is direct experiences, so that they have some quality language experiences. And because we're talking about young children, they need to use their senses. And we're going to talk about that as well. And then lastly, they need an active language partner. So that can be the caregiver as an active language partner, or that's peers as active language partners. I teach a class on assessment at the university, and we were talking about how COVID-19, because children were wearing masks and adults were wearing masks, how that has impacted children's language development because they couldn't see the mouth and how people were making pronunciation. They couldn't see facial expressions. And interestingly enough, there's research that says when adults were wearing the K95 mask, the decibels dropped by 12 decibels. The volume dropped by 12 decibels. So that it was even harder to hear. And then another thing that was interesting in the research was that the higher pitch is what got impacted the most with the masks, and children need to hear that higher pitch as well. So we know then that there have been some language delays for young children as a result of COVID-19. And so as we talk about today, we're talking about how do you offset some of that as we help children develop language. So what I'm going to focus on a lot is this notion of quality experiences, that children's experiences are going to influence their language development. This means that they are actively exploring their environment, right? They are touching things, using their senses, smelling, sometimes tasting. They are, of course, we said, experiencing through play. For them, it's play versus they don't even realize that it's learning. And of course, these quality experiences have to be in the context of interactions with others. That was the other thing we talked about with COVID-19, was that so many children were isolated. And so they missed out on these interactions with others, and we're continuing to see ramifications of that. But experiences where children can use their senses, can tap into something concrete, is what we want to focus on. Okay, so I'm going to show you some examples here of quality experiences. And I'll just let you either unmute or in the chat. What do you notice about these, what children are doing in these pictures? What do you notice? Okay, so they're using their sense of touch. They're definitely exploring their environment. It's sensory, it's hands-on. It's child-led, interacting with the world around them. Definitely, I like that, child-led, exploring their environment, actively engage. Outside, problem solving, exploring through their hands, right? Their senses, using a lot of outside in nature, and exploring their environment, So quality experiences is just that. What you're saying there is children are actively engaged in the exploration. They are using their senses, and they're using their natural inclination is to be curious. They want to discover, they want to know. And so quality experiences are allowing them to do that, find new things around them, explore new things around them. So let's just also take a minute and look at the picture of the little girl with the bubble. The experience is one thing, but what the adult is saying is the other. So as the adult, what might I say to the little girl with the bubble to help develop language? And we're going to talk more about it, but I'm just going to give you a preview here. So, wow, how did you make that big bubble? What colors do you see? That bubble is so long, and you add the gesture. It's so long. That's right. Do you think we could pop that bubble, right? Okay, so we're going to talk, that's what I want to really focus on today is when we engage in the experiences, what language are we using as adults? And those are the strategies that we'll talk about today. And then, of course, the pumpkin, how does that pumpkin feel? And I love that she's almost tasting it, right? So using her sense of taste. That's been the hardest one to use, by the way. We've been working with pre-K teachers to have them create quality experiences where children can use their senses. And the taste is, of course, the one that, how am I going to get them to taste this and not get into trouble because they're putting it in their mouth? So basically, these direct experiences, what we find happening is that because the adult is talking with children during these experiences, we are developing language through their skills of listening and speaking. So all of these direct experiences, investigating in the garden, playing with the blocks, observing ants, one of them, they were looking at ants. What we're saying is that for young children, for them to develop vocabulary, for them to develop language, learning needs to proceed from known to unknown, simple to complex. And really, we want you to remember that learning happens from concrete to abstract. So if we go back to these photos, everything here is very concrete for children. So when I say to that boy with the blocks, what structure are you building? What are you constructing? Then it's a very concrete example that he can produce for me. So the idea then is, if you create a direct experience for children, a quality experience for young children, then they are going to listen to you engage in language. And I just put little bubbles here to kind of simulate what would the adult be saying to young children. So here she's looking at the leaf with a little magnifying glass, and the adult would say, what do you notice about the leaf shape? So shape becomes a word. What do you notice, right? Oh, do you see how the margin of the leaf has ridges all around it? The margin of the leaf has ridges. So instead of just saying the edge of the leaf or the corner, we're actually using the margin has ridges. And then the third one says, oh, feel the tip of the leaf. But instead of just saying the tip, we're also adding it's pointy and it has an apex. So what we're saying to teachers is, because children are engaging in these direct experiences that are very concrete and hands-on, I can use language that's a little higher level because whatever label I attach for them is what they're going to learn. So when I say feel the apex, and the more I say that, feel the apex on that leaf, what are children going to start to refer to the tip of that leaf as? The apex. So what we're asking, we've been working with teachers these last 2 years, and what we've been asking teachers to do is think about the language that you're going to use when you have children participate in these direct experiences, because then if you move over to the right here, they are now going to be interacting with peers, and what's going to happen is you're going to hear them using the language. So we hear children saying, oh, the leaf looks like a triangle because we asked about their shape. I see the ridges. Oh, the leaf has a pointy tip, right? And eventually they're going to also start to say, the leaf has an apex, the more that I use that with them. Trying to get my screen to move around here. So oracy then is really just listening and speaking. We say literacy is, includes writing and reading. Oracy is the listening and speaking aspect. And for young children, the adults' rich language is the language they're going to adopt and the language they're going to use. So let's just kind of look at some little examples here. And the question and here in the chat, you're just gonna, well, I'll show you in a minute. We're gonna do a little, almost like a little interactive activity. So it says, which conversations improve interactions between the teacher and the child? So let's just look at number one, and you're gonna say yes or no. So number one, the child says, I wanna ring the campana, which is the bell. And the teacher says, oh, you can't ring the campana. It's not allowed. So will that improve interactions between the teacher and the child? And you can show me thumbs up, thumbs down. You can put it in the chat. Thank you, Krista. Yes, I see you. Thumbs down. When the teacher says, you can't ring the campana, it's not allowed, then he or she is not really providing an opportunity for interactions. Let's look at the second one. The child says, look at it. They're pointing at something, and the teacher responds, that's nice, Juan. Good boy. Good job, right? So the question is, does that conversation improve interactions between the teacher and the child? And I see you right away say, could be enriched. No. Number three, the teacher says, here's the fire extinguisher. It's probably at the social dramatic play. We have a fire extinguisher like this at school. Who remembers where we keep the extinguisher? Now, does this conversation improve the interaction between the teacher and the child? Yes, yes. Allows the child to respond, because what is she? She's kind of doing an open-ended, who remembers where we keep that extinguisher? And now let's look at the last, number four, sorry. The child says, look, I found a worm. And the teacher responds, uh-oh, you'll have to wash your hands now. So yes or no? Does that improve the conversation? It might be what we want to say, but does not improve the conversation. And the last one says, oh, the teacher just has the box and she says, I wonder what fits in this box. So would that improve an interaction between the teacher and child? Yes. So now let's look at how we broke this down here. Go to the next slide. So let's look at it. because you all got all those right. So when we say, no, you can't ring the bell because it's not allowed, you've basically just closed the conversation. So there is no more give and take there as a turn taking. When you say, oh, that's nice, Juan, good boy, you're really just using empty praise. And what we've learned is that young children figure that out very quickly, that it's empty praise. The third one is, it is important and it is significant because the teacher is repeating important words. She says, here's the fire extinguisher. We have a fire extinguisher like this at school. Who remembers where we keep the extinguisher? So think of the language here that she's using and how she keeps repeating those important words so that she's now modeling, right, that higher level language for children. The no, you have to wash your hands because of the worm is really, we're focusing on safety rules. It's not about the conversation. It's not about the language. And then I wonder what fits in this box is actually a think aloud strategy. That's another strategy we use where a teacher is wondering aloud to model for children the thinking process of, I wonder what fits in this box. Do you wonder? What do you think it might be? So modeling that for children. So the idea then is asking you to be very intentional with the language that you are using when you are interacting with young children. Because the focus for young, preschool, 3, 4, 5-year-olds, 6-year-olds is language development. What we have found is, or what we know about language is that young children are first listening. They're listening to everything people around them are saying. That's their receptive language. And we purposely made that bubble larger because that is the largest aspect of their language when they come to you is they're receptive. They know way more language than they sometimes produce. So receptive is what they've received, the language that they've been receiving, they're listening to. The expressive language is now what they can say, what their speaking ability. So the listening and speaking is their oracy. And our focus should be on oracy because that's the foundation for writing and reading, right? That's that foundation for writing and reading when we get into how we're going to lead into that emergent literacy. Okay, so receptive language, even if they're not speaking to you, they're listening to you. They're listening to all that language that you're using. Eventually, it'll become expressive. They're going to start using it. And then that vocabulary, that oracy, they'll use in their literacy. And also notice, a lot of times we say listening, speaking, reading, and writing, but we've really switched it to listening, speaking, writing, and reading. Because for young children, writing is actually easier than reading. Because writing, it's my message. I put on paper what I wanted to say. You may not be able to understand what I wrote because it's developmental writing, but I know what I wanted to say. I had something important to say, and that's why I wrote it down. So writing is actually much easier for children than reading because reading, now I have to interpret somebody else's message. Now I have to decode and comprehend. And so we are also reminding teachers, the more children write, the more they can read because the writing process is phonetic and they will use that skill in their reading. But that's actually another workshop. Okay, so language development is a sequence. A lot of you said it, they go through stages. Definitely part of that stage is receptive and then expressive. So let's talk about bilingual children. Emerging bilinguals is the term we're using now. We used to say English language learner. We've said dual language learner, which we still use. But now the field is really moving to emerging bilingual because that young child, their bilingual skills are developing, just like emergent literacy, they're developing. So let's just do a little, I'm a professor, so right away there's a quiz here. Let's just do a little true and false. The first question, you can type it in the chat. Bilingual or multilingual children exhibit confusion when learning different languages. Would that be true or false? Very good, very good. That is definitely false. It's not confusion. We'll talk some more about that. The second one, bilingual children are creative in their language use, creative language users. I see some true. Yes, I've noticed that. True, yes. Okay, let's look at the third one. Bilingual children learn to separate languages based on the audience, who they're talking to, based on who they're talking to. Yes, does anybody know by what age they can do that? Yes, I saw somebody said, let me see. Jolynn said by the age of 3, by the age of 3. Lee Gardner said that too, by the age of 3. Megan, great. And Jeanette, by the age of 3, isn't that amazing? At such a young age, they've only been on this earth 36 months and they can already separate language based on the speaker. The last one now, let's look at number 4. Bilingual children develop language in informal and formal and informal spaces, contexts. Yes, so what would be an informal context? What would be an informal context? Home, playing, the park. Yes, when they're playing with each other at church, in the grocery store, all of that is informal, definitely. Definitely. Snacking with siblings, right. So here you all did really well. You did really well with that. So when we talk about young emergent bilingual children, what we want you to remember is this concept of linguistic repertoire. Linguistic repertoire. This notion that all of us have language skills that represent our experiences, our lives, our trajectories. All of us have these language skills. So my linguistic repertoire has elements of Spanish as well as elements of English. So our linguistic repertoire, or your linguistic repertoire, includes a combination of skills and knowledge of one or more languages. Even if you're not completely fluent in another language, I always joke around that sometimes all you know in Spanish is otra cerveza, por favor, which means another beer, please. But all of us have some skill in another language, and that comprises our linguistic repertoire. So I want you to think about it. What languages do you speak? You can put that in the chat. Even if it's just, I know a little bit of French, but what languages do you speak? What is your linguistic repertoire? English, Spanish, and Arabic. English and Korean. English and Italian, a little bit of Portuguese. So, Español como un bebé. A little bit of Spanish, baby Spanish, right? So if you think, so what the idea here is to say, I speak English and Korean. So my linguistic repertoire, if that's what you typed in there, comprises elements of English as well as Korean. If you typed in, I speak Spanish, English, and French, then your linguistic repertoire comprises elements of all 3 languages. And that's what we're trying for you to understand about young children, that they come in, they may speak more dominant in Spanish, but have some English skills, and their linguistic repertoire reflects that. It reflects some Spanish and some English. Sign language, definitely part of your linguistic repertoire, Darlene, that's right. So linguistic repertoire. So if you have a young child in your center who is really speaks more English at home, but after school, he's picked up by his Spanish-speaking grandfather, and he spends a lot of time after school with his Spanish-speaking grandfather, then we're going to hear that child's linguistic repertoire represent a lot of English with also elements of Spanish as well. So let's look at this in print. I was observing children in the Sociodramatic Play Center. This is Brianna. She's predominantly Spanish speaker, but her repertoire includes English. and they're playing. So she says, tenga, señor. And I put it in parentheses, the translation. Let's put it in here, tenga. Ay, lo tiene que pagar. Lo tiene que pagar con dinero. Aquí tiene, señor. So if you look, I color coded it. We see that Brianna's, oh, and then the next column, she says, and your tortillas? ¿Qué le pasaron a las tortillas? So if we just look at Brianna, what can we say about her linguistic repertoire? So we see in red is what she's saying in Spanish, in blue is what she's saying in English. And then I just, in parentheses, I'm translating it for you. So what can we say about her linguistic repertoire? That she is definitely using both languages. She's using Spanish and English. And I know this is on paper, so you don't get to hear it, but it's fluid. She doesn't, it's just the conversation is fluid, right? She just easily switches from one language to the other. In the second line where she says, let's put it in here, tenga, even within that one sentence, she switched from one language to the other, right? So it's very fluid. And she definitely can understand both, even though she's predominantly Spanish speaking. So Brianna here, the other thing is, she says, let's put it in here, and she points. I know this is on paper, so you don't see, but she points. So she's also using gestures. Gestures are a form of communication. And so that encompasses our linguistic repertoire as well. Now, here, I'm going to let you hear it, and let me set it up for you. This is a 3-year-old. He's in a dual language classroom, but he's predominantly English speaking, but predominantly the day is spent in Spanish because it's an 80-20 dual language classroom. And then on the right-hand side, I kind of already put what he had to say, but what we're doing is listening to his linguistic repertoire and how he uses that. And I am the person videotaping here. And so I repeat what he says just because I wanted to make sure that we captured it for the video. So I'm going to play it and then we'll talk about it.
Make the clean pool and yucky pool.
A clean pool and a yucky pool?
The mains.
What are you going to put in the yucky pool?
I'm going to make the yucky pool. I'm going to botellas.
Botellas?
Yeah.
Because it's contaminated?
Yeah.
What else goes in the yucky pool?
Put trash on it.
Trash?
Put trash on it. Put trash on it. Put
Okay.
trash on it. You do the contaminated. Now do green.
What's he doing, Albert?
I'm doing the same thing as on Pablo.
And what is that?
And I need the contaminated. This side is the contaminated one. This one's the clean side.
Okay. And what goes in the contaminated side?
And how come it makes
Right.
yucky?
It made it yucky?
And the main, the first one.
Yes.
The first. How do you make contaminated one? I don't remember.
You put some trash in it. You put some dirty water.
Yellow and what? And blue?
Sure.
Oh. I need negro.
You need negro
Yeah, for the botellas.
for the botella.
I just saw my mama leaving. Can I bring it to her house?
Sure, you can take it home. Sure.
I have a nice house. I have my cat.
Ignatius, what are you making, Ignatius?
I mean the orange, please. Enough orange, please.
What are you making?
Rainbow.
A river. What's going to be inside
A
your river?
rainbow botella. A rainbow botella.
Okay. So on the side here, I have what he says is, I'm going to make a clean pool and a yucky pool. And it's hard to understand when he says but he says the names. And what he's wanting me to tell him is, how do I write yucky and how do I write clean? That's what he keeps asking me. But we hear him using Spanish when he says botellas, which means bottles. And he says, I'm going to put trash in it because it's yucky, it's dirty, right? And then he says, oh, I need negro for the botellas. So he uses both languages there. And then at the end, he's asking Ignatius, may I have the orange, please? The orange marker. So what could we say about his, Juan Pablo, that first little boy, what can we say about his linguistic repertoire? And again, you can unmute or you can use the chat. But what can we say about he code switches. All right, Elizabeth knows that term. He code switches. I'll talk more about that in a minute. He understands both. Why do you think he's using some words in Spanish? Where did he hear those words? Or who did he hear those words from?
I'm going to guess maybe at home if his classroom is English.
So in this case, the classroom is predominantly Spanish. So 80% of his day is in Spanish. So the teacher has been using, because home is more English for him. And so he hears the language the teacher is using, and you're going to see a video of that in a minute. And that's the language that he's adopted, right? So the word that she wanted them to use was contaminated, and for yucky, but he uses yucky. So does he understand the concept of contaminated? Yeah, right. It's yucky. He says it's trash. We have to put trash. We have to put botellas. Albert is the other little bit across from him, and Albert is actually using that vocabulary, contaminated. Even though a lot of what the teacher was saying was contaminada in Spanish, but they're actually adopted that language. So what we are saying, well, I'm getting ahead of myself. So here, his linguistic repertoire encompasses aspects of both English and Spanish. You hear how he fluidly goes back and forth. Albert understands both languages. That's a little bit across from him. And of course, he's able to function and use both languages as well. Let me get to the next. My next slide. So Elizabeth, I think, said code switching. He's code switching. Yes, it's very common. Those of you who are bilingual know this. It's very common for emerging bilinguals to use both of their languages when speaking. You'll hear them say, like, yo leyendo un book. And what we want to remind you is that that's not evidence of confusion. It's really a complex linguistic pattern of speech that young children, again, very young children, as soon as they start speaking, will engage, if they're emerging bilinguals, in this concept of code switching. Because if you remember from the beginning of the session, I said, young children, their priority is to communicate. It's not about what language to use, how do I pronounce it, it's about to communicate. And so because their priority is communication, they just use all of their language skills. In this case, English and Spanish. So when you have a young child like Azucena who points to her sippy cup and says, more leche, which means more milk, she's really using her ability to seamlessly make use of her language to communicate a message. So in this case, she used a hand gesture, she points, and she used her English and her Spanish to communicate. And that's what we call languaging. These are the creative bilingual practices that young children will engage in, using sounds, movement, objects, and languages to communicate with others. So languaging is this notion of, for young children, I know that I want to use language to communicate. I am not thinking about, should I say this in English? Should I say this in Spanish? I'm prioritizing communication. So here's another example. Here, these were two children at the writing center. And Antonio says, I'm going to tell my mom that I love her. And he draws a heart on this piece of paper. You see the heart. And then Sandra says, yo le voy a dar un kiss, pero no de chocolate. And she actually kisses the paper because she has some lip gloss, and she kisses the paper so that you see her lips. So again, let's think about their linguistic repertoire. They're using English and Spanish skills. They're using symbols, because the heart symbolizes what? Love, right? So when Antonio says, I'm going to tell my mom that I love her, he uses the symbol of the heart. So when we communicate, and young children as well, they're using language, gestures, symbols, movement, sounds, all of that to communicate. And all of that is their linguistic repertoire, not just the language of English and Spanish in this case, but the symbols, the sounds, as part of that linguistic, and multiple representations for kiss. Right. That's the other thing, is that Sandra, in this case, understood kiss could be that little chocolate kiss, but it can also be the kiss that she does with her lips, right? So multiple representations. That's another skill bilingual children have, is that we have multiple labels for the same thing. So all of children's daily experiences are going to contribute to this linguistic repertoire. And when you are working with young emerging bilingual children and they are communicating with you, you're going to hear them mix and mesh their languages. You're going to, which is a very natural, normal phenomenon. Their languages will interact with one another because that is how they are communicating and making meaning. That's how they communicate and make meaning. So one question we receive many times is, what if I don't speak my students' language? So if they come to me and they're mixing and meshing languages, then what should I do if I don't speak their language? And I'll see what you all think first. What should I do? So let's go back to when Azucena says, more leche. Well, the language I use depends on the language I'm trying to develop. If she was at home with me as the parent, I would say, ¿quieres más leche? Déjame darte más leche. I would use Spanish. I'm the parent. If she's at a center where they're using predominantly the language is English, then I would say, oh, you want some more milk? Let me give you some more milk. So the language I use is based on the language that I'm trying to develop. And I see that you're saying I would show them pictures. Yes, if you feel that they're not understanding what the language you're using, then yes, visuals. You would also use your linguistic repertoire of gestures, of movement, of sound, and visuals to communicate, because your priority would be communication. Keep in mind, like we said earlier, they're going to mix and mesh. That's not a problem, because as they get older, they will learn to separate those languages based on who they're speaking with. We said by the age of 3, but also in the context. They'll learn, in this context, I can use both of my languages. In this context, I can use only English. But as they get older, they will definitely learn to separate that. Okay, we're gonna put you in a breakout room just for about 5 minutes to give you some time to kind of process some of this. But we want you to just talk about the concept of linguistic repertoire. What does that mean? How have you seen that with your young children, your young emergent bilinguals? And keep in mind, even a native English speaker has a linguistic repertoire, because they would be using English symbols, gestures, movement, sounds as part of their linguistic repertoire. So let me see if great, thank you. Because I always forget to do that after the breakout room. And as people start coming back in, the idea here was to give you an opportunity to just kind of process what is the linguistic repertoire, what is my linguistic repertoire, and how have I seen young children using that their linguistic repertoire. Does anybody want to share something that they shared in their small group? So how are some ways that you've seen your young children engaging in their linguistic repertoire? How many of you have had kids that come and pull on your pant or your dress or your skirt? That's a gesture, right? They're using movement. What are they trying to communicate? I want your attention, or it may even be, I want you to come over here. So that's part of their linguistic repertoire, is their ability, how do they communicate? In that case, they weren't actually using language, they were using movement or a gesture, right? Pay attention, or I need something. Okay, so now let's think of the strategies that we're going to use as the adult working with young children, whether they're all English speaking, whether there are bilingual children, it doesn't matter. These are strategies that we're going to use. Keep in mind, I want you to notice 2 things. we have this notion when working with bilingual children of the language of teaching. This is the language that the teacher uses. So if my goal is to help children develop English, my language of teaching is English. But we also have the language of learning. And when young children are talking with others, they are using the language of learning. Even adults, when I put you in the breakout room or in a small group, you'll use the language of learning. So when I have young children playing with each other or working at centers together, sociodramatically, it's like Brianna earlier, where she used English and Spanish, or like Juan Pablo, how he used English and Spanish. They're going to just use whatever language skills they have. So we don't worry that, oh, they're speaking too much Spanish. Oh, they're speaking too much English. They're going to use whatever they have. And at this point, I just want them to use language. So keep the separation in your head. So the first one is really helping children acquire vocabulary through experiences in what we call conversational mapping. Conversational mapping is also known as verbal mapping, in that as children are engaging in an experience, you, the teacher, are labeling and describing objects and actions. You're labeling and describing. So you are using rich, complex language to describe the action and to name or label the object. And you're also introducing concepts that are very specific to that experience. So again, if you think about those pictures we saw earlier with the concrete experience where children were looking at the pumpkin, they were building blocks, they were looking for ants. You are verbally labeling the object and the action. And these are adult-child interactions. So you're using language that's rich, sophisticated, and language that's very complex. You're not watering it down. So here's an example. If here you see Jessie, and she's really looking at the beetle, and I say, oh, what did you just pick up? Oh, yes, it's a beetle. I can see its two antennae. Do you see its two antennae? Do you see its two sets of wings? Wow, what other body parts do you notice? So the idea in conversational mapping is, because Getsy's looking at the beetle, I can use vocabulary like antenna. I can use vocabulary like sets of wings. I can use vocabulary of body parts, because instead of just saying, oh, yeah, you picked up the bug, it's, oh, you picked up a beetle. So the idea is I'm labeling actions and objects, and I'm using rich, complex language within the context of the experience so that children will use that same language. So the whole point here is that it's, as children are engaging in the experience, you as a teacher are prepared to use complex vocabulary, you are very intentional and purposeful, and you aren't watering it down. So that means if I know we're going to go outside on a nature walk, I have to be thinking, what vocabulary am I going to be using? What might we encounter when we are out on the nature walk that I can use with my students, so that I'm very purposeful? Because whatever label I give children, that's what they're going to acquire. That's the vocabulary they're going to acquire. So you are really, as the teacher, placed at the center of the language that they're developing. So in this case, if I was being purposeful and I was thinking about, okay, I know we're going to go explore in the garden and we're going to look for insects, I might be thinking of what is some vocabulary that I might want to use. So instead of saying, oh, you see that? I would say, oh, you noticed, or let's observe what happens when. Or I would be thinking about body parts, antenna, thorax, abdomen, sets, like 3 sets of legs. I'd be thinking about words like fragile, tiny. So I have to be very purposeful in the vocabulary that we're going to be using as children are engaged in the experience. And because it's concrete and they're using their senses, I can use these higher level vocabulary and complex structure for language. So here, let's think about this for a minute. Let's kind of fill in the blank. So if I say, oh, I see that you spotted a bug, but I really want it to be, oh, we know that the beetle is a what? What could I put in the blank there? Oh, now we know that the beetle is a, what could I put in the blank there to enrich children's vocabulary? An insect, an insect. And I says, wow, let's take a look at the beetle. Oh, I noticed the beetles. What would I put in these three blanks? What could I put in these three blanks? I noticed the beetles. Oh, you could say body segments. I noticed the legs. I noticed the wings. It's two sets of wings, or it's set of wings. I noticed the antenna. Do you have antenna? And we could act it out, right? And then it says, watch the beetle. And here we say, goodbye, Mr. Beetle. So what could we say that the beetle did? I noticed that, watch, the beetle flew away. And I could also even say, I wonder where it's going. Or the beetle is crawling away. Because again, we're looking at vocabulary. All we're trying to do is augment children's vocabulary, but we're also doing it intentionally, thinking of how am I going to augment their language? Okay, I'm going to show you this video. It is in Spanish. So let me set it up for you. This is the same classroom where we saw the other three little boys. It's a 80-20 dual language classroom. So 80% of their days in Spanish. These are 3- and 4-year-olds. The children you saw earlier, those were 3-year-olds. They are English and Spanish speaking. So some children come in, they're only English speaking. Some come in, they're only Spanish speaking. Some children already have both. The teacher's doing a lesson, or the theme, the unit was water. And in this particular lesson, they're talking about how we need to keep water clean. So we need to be careful not to contaminate it, which is, of course, earlier you saw the after effect of the video where the two little children were talking about clean and dirty with contaminated water. So she's going to use words like oil, petroleum, industrial waste, plastic, and contaminated. And so again, what we're looking at, what I want you to look at is children are going to be engaged in an experience. It's hands-on. They're using their senses. They're interacting with others. And I want you to pay attention to the language that the teacher is using.
El desecho industrial. Espérate, Rosy. Vamos a hacer Lincoln, si tú tienes una hojilla, agarra el desecho industrial. Todavía no.
So they use clothespins to know who's going to go first. So she says, if you have the clothespin, you go first. And what she's telling them to get is the industrial waste.
Enséñamelo, enséñaselo a la maestra. Ahora sí, vamos a contaminar el agua desafortunadamente. Vamos a contaminar el agua. Vamos a el líquido adentro del norte.
So she says, unfortunately, we're going to contaminate the water. Pour the liquid into the container. She says the industrial waste contaminated the water. So now she says, if you're the one that doesn't have the clothespin, now you're going to get the petroleum.
Gracias por dar instrucciones. Ahora sí, vamos a contaminar el agua otra vez, haciendo el líquido allá abajo. ¿Está limpia el agua? No, está limpia el agua, está limpia el agua. Está limpia, no.
So she's asking, is the water clean? Okay. And they're going to add plastic bottles, which is why earlier you heard a little boy saying botellas, and they add plastic forks and utensils. So the idea here is, while they're engaging in the experience, the teacher is mapping actions and objects. So what do you notice, or what comments, what's your response? And again, you can unmute or you can use the chat. And I'll remind you, these are 3- and 4-year-olds. So they definitely, even though some of these children are more dominant in English, they do understand. But the other thing is that other children will help them, like, oh, she's telling you to do this or to do that. But they definitely understand, because she's already modeled the process of contaminating the water. So they're definitely saying, oh, it turned yellow, it turned green. They're actively engaged. Are they using their senses? Yeah, you even see the little boy who smells it, and he kind of wrinkles his nose. So they can't actually taste it, right? But they're definitely using their senses. It's hands-on. Is it concrete? Is it a concrete activity versus abstract? Yes, because they can see the water becoming contaminated. Yeah, they definitely are looking to their peers. And of course, her language of instruction is Spanish, but the language of learning was English and Spanish. It didn't matter what language they used, as long as they were engaging in the activity. So even though, yeah, they're definitely enjoying it. And I know the whole trading of the clothespins was like, no, that's not the point of the clothespins, but okay. So the thing is, she's using a rich language, right? Unfortunately, she says, unfortunately, we're going to contaminate the water. And she's using, industrial waste. We're going to put plastic, petroleum, and oil. So children are listening to that. Remember, we talked about receptive, that listening is the bigger bubble. So they're listening to that language. They may not be using it yet, but they will the more they engage. So all week long, they worked on what happens when we contaminate the water. They wrote about it, they read about it. And then what you saw in the video earlier was the little boys at the center, the writing center, creating their clean pool and yucky pool, how they've interpreted what the lesson was for that week. So conversational mapping is labeling actions and objects as children are engaged in the process. And why is this so critical is because children are going to learn the names for things where they are focused on it. This was the focus of their attention. So the more she would repeat it and say, we're going to contaminate the water, and they see it, they're using their senses, they are experiencing it, the more they're going to adopt the language, in this case, contaminated. So we want you to think about, when I have children engage in these experiences, what is the rich vocabulary that I'm going to be using? What's the rich vocabulary that I'm going to be using? And I have to think about it. I have to be intentional because I have to be ready for that. The second strategy is this expanding and recasting, where we're trying to model high quality language input. So here, and a lot of you, I bet, are really good at this because you've been working with children for a long time, is expanding what children say so that we listen closely to what they're saying and we repeat what they've said, but we also produce more complex language, more complex syntax. So the example I give here is if the child says, he just holds up the blade of grass, right? And just says grass. For me to expand on that, I have to say, oh, you're holding a grass plant from our garden. Did you notice its long leaves? So then now I repeated what he said, grass, but now I've expanded to produce a more complete, complex sentence. So that now I'm modeling not just more vocabulary, but the complex sentence structure, the complex syntax. That's expanding. Recasting is where now I'm going to, I notice that the child says something that's maybe not pronounced correctly, and so I need to model it. So now I'm going to recast the word or the sentence using a complete sentence, but also standard vocabulary. So if he says, the child says, him kick the ball, you know already as an adult that you say, oh, he kicked the ball far. So now I've actually modeled, I recasted, and I expanded. He kicked the ball far. Here's the thing that happens, teachers, and I know it's because it's happened with me. We're a lot going on. We're doing a lot of things. I'm monitoring a lot of children at one time. So I'm not always thinking about, oh, I have to expand and recast. And for some of us, it takes practice. It takes practice, and we have to be very intentional and thinking about it. For some of you, it's natural. It's very natural for you. For those of you who might just be starting as a teacher, it is going to require some intentionality and some for you to be thinking about, how do I want to recast? How do I want to expand? But the idea is children need exposure to that advanced language. So I have to provide that, just like I did with conversational mapping, right? Where I'm labeling objects and actions. Here I'm expanding using advanced language. And it really should be very natural. It's in that conversation. It's a give and take, turn and take. And what happens is, because I'm not correcting children, but recasting it, then it leads to more confidence in their thinking and speaking, and leads, of course, to more interactions with others. Those of you who are Spanish speaking, you know that young children will say, yo sabo, instead of yo sé. It means I know. In English, they might say, I knowed it. I knowed it. So we're going to just recast it. Oh, you know that happened, right? We're recasting it. Yes, they say that all the time. So instead of correcting, no, that's not how we say it. I'm just recasting it in a very natural conversation. Like, let's look at this example. This is a 3-year-old, and they were doing, again, water. And they were outside with the water, and they had water in a larger bucket. And Mario picks up the twig and throws it into the bucket of water. And he notices that the twig floats, because that was their concept, sink and float. And he says, look, arriba. He's trying to say arriba, which means like on top, but he says arriba. So he doesn't quite pronounce the double R. So the teacher, though, her language of instruction was English. So she's going to repeat, yes, you noticed how the twig floats on the water. So that's the difference. What language should I be using? What's the language of instruction? So here she repeats what he says. She recasts it, and she expands on it. You notice how the twig floats on the water. And then she follows up with an open-ended question. What else do you notice? So I want you to just think a minute. What did the teacher focus on? I asked the question here at the bottom, what did the teacher do? But what did she focus on? Did she focus on the mispronunciation? Did she focus on the code switching? The communication and the meaning, right? She focused on what what he had to say, of course. Sorry, I'm getting ahead of myself. And focus on the meaning. Because remember when we started this whole session today, children's priority is to communicate, to make meaning. So that's what we're going to focus on is, did he understand the concept? I'm going to validate what he had to say. I'm going to expand it, and I'm going to continue to encourage that learning. Right. So let's look at this one. The child says, mi doggy me lambia, which means my doggy licks me. So the child says, mi doggy me lambia. So I want you to type in the chat based on your language of instruction. What would you say to expand or recast? Well, he says, mi doggy me lambia, which means my doggy licks me. So if you're a Spanish speaker, you say, ay, mi perro me lambe también. And if you're an English speaker, you say, yes, the dog licked you on your face. Oh my gosh, how did that feel? Right? Oh, he licked you with his tongue. How did the tongue feel? The same thing when the child says, doggy licked me, right? Then it's the same thing. Oh, he licked you. So it's expanding, recasting, expanding and recasting. Yeah. Oh, your doggy licks you? How did that feel? I wonder why dogs lick our faces. That's a good open-ended question. So here it is. This is how I would say, ¿de veras? Mi perrito también me lambe. So I just repeated it in Spanish because that's my goal, is for the child to learn more Spanish. Oh, the doggy licked you on your nose. So the idea then with expanding and recasting is to focus on meaning versus correctness. The correctness is going to come as they get older. You are focusing on meaning. Are you understanding the message that they're trying to communicate? And again, I've been talking about it, but how is it that you should respond when children mix languages? No. What should you do when they mix the languages? Do we say, oh, we only speak English in this classroom? Of course not, right? Let me see what you're saying. We validate and recast, right? Or we don't respond with your language, the language of instruction. Recast if necessary. Respond naturally in your language. Recast and expand. Respond in one language. That's a good point, Nilda. Don't do the code switching. You, the teacher, are staying in one language because you're modeling. This is the language I want you to develop. So I'm going to model that language. So respond in the language of teaching, Right. Okay. The last strategy is open-ended questions, which we've already kind of seen happening here. But again, it's this notion that I want to ask children an open-ended question so that because my whole focus is to develop language. So I want to have this turn-taking, model this conversational turn-taking, and model, of course, the ability to ask questions. That's also a skill that children are learning. So earlier I asked you about the bubble and the little girl. An open-ended question, why do you think that bubble is so long? Look how long it is. Some of you had said that earlier too. Again, we know what an open-ended question is versus a close-ended, but we have a tendency, not everybody, but a lot of us have a tendency to ask close-ended questions. Oh my God, you're playing with the bubbles. Are we having fun? Right? Oh, did you like the bubbles? Versus, tell me about what you're doing instead of, are you having fun? Or what about the bubbles do you like? Or instead of saying, did you see how high that bubble went? Why do you think that bubble went so high? So the thing is, again, for some of you, this is a very natural, you've been doing this a long time and you're like, I know how to do open-ended questions. For others, I have to think about it. As a parent with my own child, I had to think about it. I found myself always asking close-ended questions. And I had to really think about, how do I want to frame this to be open-ended to get him to use more language? By the way, now he's 20 and I still have to do that. Come on, talk to me. Give me some, I'm going to use open-ended questions through texting, of course. Now it's all through texting. So here are some tips, since we know that it's so much easier to do close-ended. Try posing it as a problem. What would happen if, think about that bubble. What would happen if we double dipped it into the liquid? Or think about possibilities. What would change if instead of soap, we used milk? What would change? So think about possibilities. Or clarify thinking. How do you think that works? I mean, how is it that the soap and the water are making bubbles? And then the fourth tip is to spark wonder, right? I wonder why that bubble is so long. I wonder why that bubble popped. So it's these. So again, the tip is pose it as a problem, think about possibilities, ask them to clarify their thinking, and spark wonder. Okay, let's look at this one. Here, the child, they were out looking at for insects. They found a butterfly. So what open-ended questions would you use if you're the adult and what they have in their hands is they found the butterfly? What open-ended questions would you use? And I'm going to remind you to think of one of these. I wonder where the butterfly was going. Where do you think the butterfly was going, right? I wonder, where do you think the butterfly was going? Okay, I see you asking what colors do you see, but what colors do you see is a close-ended because it's a right or wrong answer. So the open-ended is, I wonder why this butterfly, this monarch butterfly, has so many colors. I wonder why it has these different colors. Why does it have these patterns? Look at these patterns that it has. Do you see the difference? So you're still pointing their attention to the color, but you're phrasing it as an open-ended. I wonder why it has these colors, or why does it have these patterns? What do you think it was? A good one I like to ask is, what do you think it's thinking right now that we've caught it? What might it be thinking? So also, the idea is for you to also think about what vocabulary could we be using that's higher level. You could say, look how that butterfly's wings are fluttering. Look how they're fluttering. Or I could say, oh my gosh, this butterfly has 6 jointed legs. 6 jointed legs, 4 long and 2 short. And because they can see it, that's why I can use the term jointed. And the more I have them engage in these experiences, the more they'll use it. The antenna, it's clubbed or it's tipped. The antenna, scaly wings. So the idea is we are good at saying, oh, I see the monarch butterfly. Like we've added the monarch part. But how good are we at saying, look at those scaly wings, or look at how it might be transparent. How good are we at saying jointed legs? So it's getting us to think about, how do I augment children's vocabulary while they're engaging in these direct experiences? How do I do that? Because whatever label I give it, that's the label they're going to acquire. So remember, when we're asking open-ended questions, listening to their answer is just as important as asking the question. Because we do have a tendency, right, to not have that wait time to allow children to respond. An open-ended question, there's no right or wrong answer. The idea behind the open-ended question is you're trying to inspire creativity. You're trying to get at what are they thinking? So you want them to express themselves. And you're also getting them to use this notion of richness of detail, which where are they going to use that later? In their writing, richness of detail. And then again, just like conversational mapping, expanding and recasting, open-ended questions require intentionality. I really have to be intentional with whatever activity we're going to engage in. I have to already think ahead of time, what open-ended questions am I going to ask? Okay, I see that we don't have a lot of time, so I'm going to ask you to just think about these questions without going into the breakout room. But why is it that these three strategies are so critical for language development? I want you to think about that for a minute. You can type it, but I want you to just really think about it. And then ideally, I would like you to unmute, but you're welcome to type it in the chat. Why are these strategies so critical for language development?
I think there was kind of a theme that I noticed, and maybe it's because I took a webinar last night about traditional classroom management versus culturally responsive. And you said several times about making sure that it's not a right or wrong, not correcting, kind of honoring it as an experience. And I think too many times we kind of close in on that. Oh, I can't understand what you're saying, or I didn't so I really like that there is a theme of it's not wrong, we're honoring, I'm listening to your answer. So I thought that was really important, especially in early childhood.
Right. Thank you for sharing that. Oh, let me see the chat. Yeah, all of these we're encouraging children to expand their language. We're building vocabulary, we're augmenting, but we're also, I like what Mary Roy said, we're building confidence in their ability to communicate, building confidence in their ability. So, when you just said we're validating, we're supporting, we're honoring, that's building confidence in their ability to communicate. Yeah, giving them confidence and expanding on their vocabulary. I have student teachers that I'm working with, and they are working with 3-year-olds, and they said, but Dr. Lanise, they don't talk. And I said, but they're listening to you. So whatever language you use, they are listening and they will acquire it, right? So you're building on those language skills. Really, the idea is that when we create these experiences, you're giving children these spaces, right, where you're giving opportunities to involve them in active learning that's meaningful. So because it's meaningful to me and I'm actively engaged, there's joint attention. So I'm paying attention and I'm listening to the vocabulary that you're using. So when it's at the center of their attention, they will acquire that vocabulary, versus if I just, it's not even the same if I read them a book and we talked about the butterfly. It's the actual seeing the butterfly, the experience, where I say, look at the jointed legs, that's what they're going to associate with that activity and that label. Okay, really, I leave you with this action plan before I'm going to switch over to Susie, who has some announcements, is for you to just really think about what's one thing you plan to do tomorrow, if you're back in the classroom tomorrow, or the next day, but what's one thing you plan to do to develop children's language? And you can say, I plan to, and I really would like everybody to type that in the chat. I plan to do what's one thing I plan to do? And also there's the QR code for the presentation. Thank you, Rosie. Thank you, Colin. Yes, I see that, Nilda. Colleen, great. Sankhya, good. Intentionality is crucial. Using that academic vocabulary. Getting them to interact more with each other, right? So that they are using that language. Thank you, Kelly. Yes, rich vocabulary with details. That's right, Lisa. Oh, good, Jennifer. You're going to share with your team. Being more proactive. Yes, thank you guys so much. I really appreciate your time today. Let me stop the share. And Susie's going to post some announcements, but also Susie has the QR code if you didn't get a chance to get it. Thank you guys so much for responding in the chat.
Great. Thank you so much, everybody. We really appreciate you joining us today. So this is a flyer that is going to discuss ESL and bilingual credential and scholarship opportunities. So the link for this flyer is going to be provided in the follow-up email that you will be getting today from ECPL. And it there's some opportunities through gateways, and then there is some additional opportunities through ECACE. All those letters. Anyway, but the links will be there. The flyer will be provided to you. And then you also should have received the QR code. If not, that QR code will also be in the follow-up email. So we would ask that you please complete the evaluation. And then once the evaluation is completed, you will be receiving your evidence of completion. And then also don't forget that we have 2 additional webinars coming up. We will have another one on November 29th. And that is also a Spanish speaking one. And then we will have another one in December, and that is December 11th. So we would love to have you join us for that. Registration is open on the ECPL website at eclearningil.org. So registration is open for those already. So if you choose to do so, we would love to have you join us for those as well. So if anybody has any additional questions, please feel free to type them in the chat room. Otherwise, the webinar is complete and you are welcome to exit the room.